Ladies and gentlemen, there's a fascinating dynamic at play when we look at why some men are drawn to women who seem emotionally detached. At first glance, this behavior might seem counterintuitive. Why would someone be attracted to a partner who is emotionally distant, unavailable, or hard to connect with on a deeper level? To understand this, we must explore the workings of the human mind, emotions, and our subconscious programming. At the core of this dynamic is the way the brain operates. From an early age, many of us are conditioned to associate certain behaviors with attraction and value. For men, the pursuit of emotional detachment often triggers a deeply ingrained belief that something elusive or hard to attain is valuable. It activates a sense of challenge, something that needs to be earned. The idea of winning someone's affection, especially when that affection is not freely given, can be incredibly compelling. The mind perceives the emotional distance as a challenge to overcome, creating a sense of urgency and excitement. This challenge activates the reward system in the brain, releasing dopamine, the chemical responsible for feelings of pleasure and accomplishment. Essentially, the more emotionally detached a woman is, the more the brain interprets this as an opportunity to win, pushing the man to invest more energy and effort into winning her attention and affection. This cycle creates an addiction to the chase itself, rather than to the actual emotional connection. It's the pursuit, the idea of breaking through emotional barriers, that becomes the fixation. What's important to understand here is that men are not inherently addicted to women who are emotionally detached, but rather to the process and the emotional payoff of succeeding in a seemingly difficult pursuit. The brain gets hooked on the anticipation of emotional connection, even when that connection is not truly reciprocated. However, this dynamic often leads to a dangerous cycle of emotional depletion for both partners. The more emotionally detached one partner becomes, the more the other may invest in pursuit, while real, deep connection and intimacy get sidelined. Over time, this imbalance can create frustration, emotional exhaustion, and dissatisfaction in both individuals. It's crucial to recognize that while the chase may be thrilling in the short term, true fulfillment comes from an emotional connection built on trust, vulnerability, and shared intimacy, not from the illusion of distance. Attraction is a powerful force, often driven by factors beyond our conscious awareness. It's shaped by a complex mix of biological, psychological, and emotional triggers that guide our behaviors and desires. When we look at why some individuals are drawn to emotional detachment and others, we need to understand how attraction functions on a deeper level. At its core, attraction is tied to the brain's reward system. We are wired to seek connection, validation, and pleasure, and our subconscious mind constantly evaluates potential partners through this lens. For some people, emotional detachment activates a part of the brain that associates this behavior with something valuable or difficult to attain. In many cases, the human brain finds novelty, unpredictability, and the unknown to be exciting. Emotional detachment often signals mystery, which can trigger a heightened sense of curiosity and desire to break through emotional walls. When a person seems distant or emotionally unavailable, it creates a challenge. The mind views this as a puzzle to be solved, a barrier to overcome. This taps into the brain's natural desire for achievement and success, particularly when the reward feels earned. The more unattainable the emotional connection appears, the more the individual is driven to pursue it. This process releases dopamine, a neurotransmitter linked to feelings of pleasure and reward, every small step toward. Breaking down that emotional wall feels like a victory, reinforcing the behavior and creating a feedback loop that keeps the individual coming back for more. However, this pursuit is not always rooted in the desire for genuine connection. The chase itself, the challenge of winning someone over, becomes a powerful motivator. It's the act of overcoming emotional distance that creates a sense of fulfillment. The deeper the emotional detachment, the more the brain associates it with success, and the more the individual may become addicted to the cycle. This dynamic can be exhilarating in the short term, but often leads to emotional frustration when the actual connection remains shallow or unbalanced. Emotional detachment plays a significant role in the dynamics of relationships, often serving as an unconscious trigger for attraction. When someone is emotionally distant or hard to connect with, it may seem paradoxical that another person becomes increasingly drawn to them. However, understanding the psychology behind emotional detachment reveals the powerful underlying factors. The human mind is wired to respond to what feels unfamiliar or challenging. When a person withdraws emotionally, it creates a sense of distance, and in that gap lies a unique attraction. The brain is naturally drawn to what it cannot easily have, and this often leads to an intense drive to pursue that unattainable connection. This sense of emotional detachment can trigger a desire to break through barriers, to be the one who wins the affection of someone who is otherwise distant. The subconscious mind associates emotional distance with a challenge that needs to be overcome. The pursuit of this challenge becomes a powerful motivator, engaging the reward system in the brain. Each small victory in breaking through the emotional walls builds a sense of accomplishment and releases dopamine, reinforcing the behavior. The more difficult it seems to connect emotionally with someone, the more rewarding it feels when progress is made. This release of dopamine reinforces the cycle, encouraging the individual to continue pursuing the emotionally detached person. In many ways, the emotional chase becomes addictive. It's not necessarily the person themselves that is sought after, but the emotional journey, the thrill of breaking through barriers and getting closer to a person who initially seemed unreachable. Over time, this pattern can create an emotional attachment to the chase rather than to the actual person, with the pursuit of emotional closeness becoming more about winning the challenge than about forming a true connection. The power of emotional detachment lies in its ability to keep someone invested in the process, making them believe that emotional closeness is just out of reach, and only through persistence can it be attained. The attraction to emotional detachment can often be traced back to the way the brain responds to challenge and reward. When a person is emotionally distant, it creates a sense of mystery and uncertainty, which the brain interprets as something to be solved or overcome. Humans are naturally drawn to the unknown, and the presence of emotional distance from a potential partner ignites a deep curiosity. This curiosity is often fueled by the desire to break through that emotional barrier, to unlock the mystery and gain access to something that feels just out of reach. The mind experiences this pursuit as a challenge, and challenges naturally engage our drive and determination. In many cases, when someone is emotionally detached, it activates a subconscious response that associates emotional unavailability with value. The more difficult it is to connect emotionally, the more the brain perceives the individual as valuable or desirable. This perception is often rooted in the belief that things that are difficult to attain must be more worthwhile. As a result, the pursuit becomes less about the person themselves and more about overcoming an obstacle. The emotional chase becomes the focal point of the attraction, and the brain rewards the individual with bursts of dopamine as they make progress in breaking down the emotional walls. The cycle of emotional pursuit can quickly become addictive, especially when the rewards are so closely tied to overcoming emotional barriers. Each step closer to emotional connection feels like a small victory, reinforcing the behavior and driving the individual to keep pushing for more. This cycle can create an unhealthy attachment to the chase itself, where the focus is no longer on fostering a deep emotional connection, but on the validation and sense of accomplishment that comes with breaking through the detachment. Over time, this dynamic can lead to an imbalance in the relationship, where the emotional availability of one partner remains out of reach, while the other continues to invest in a pursuit that may not yield the desired connection. The attraction to emotionally detached individuals often stems from a complex psychological process rooted in the brain's reward system. When someone is emotionally distant, it creates an element of scarcity, a sense that something valuable is just beyond reach. Our minds are wired to pursue what we perceive as rare or difficult to obtain. Emotional detachment signals to the brain that the connection is something worth striving for, triggering a natural drive to close that distance. In this way, emotional detachment becomes a catalyst for the brain's desire to engage in the pursuit of what seems unattainable. As the emotional wall becomes higher, the brain's response intensifies. The challenge itself, not necessarily the person, becomes the focus. This challenge engages the brain's reward centers, releasing dopamine with every small step toward gaining emotional closeness. It's the same chemical that motivates us to pursue any form of achievement, reinforcing the behavior and encouraging continued effort. This process creates an addictive cycle, where the thrill of emotional pursuit, the idea of breaking down walls and getting closer to someone who is emotionally detached, becomes the main attraction. The more detached a person is, the more enticing they may appear, simply because the brain sees them as a valuable challenge. However, this drive to break through emotional barriers can often overshadow the actual need for true emotional connection. Over time, the attraction may shift from wanting to build an authentic, mutual relationship to wanting to conquer the challenge of emotional detachment. This can lead to emotional exhaustion as the person on the pursuit side continues to invest energy into something that may never result in the emotional connection they are seeking. What begins as an attraction to emotional distance can slowly morph into an unhealthy attachment to the chase itself, reinforcing a cycle where real intimacy is lost in the pursuit of an idealized emotional breakthrough. The dynamic between emotional detachment and attraction often leads to a powerful and complex cycle of pursuit. When someone is emotionally distant, it creates an internal conflict in the brain. On one hand, the natural desire for connection and intimacy is present. On the other, the emotional distance feels like a challenge. This challenge triggers the brain's reward system, particularly the areas associated with motivation and achievement. The more emotionally detached a person is, the more the brain perceives them as something to be won. The process of overcoming emotional walls feels like a game, and each small breakthrough along the way brings with it a sense of accomplishment, a rush of dopamine. This biochemical reward reinforces the behavior and encourages continued effort. Attraction is deeply influenced by the subconscious mind, and in many cases, it's not the person themselves who is desired, but the pursuit of breaking through their emotional defenses. The more a person withdraws emotionally, the more enticing the pursuit becomes. This detachment becomes a symbol of something rare, valuable, and worth striving for. In this way, emotional distance is equated with value, and the person becomes a target for a challenge to be conquered. The thrill of the chase overshadows the possibility of genuine emotional connection. The mind becomes fixated on the idea of winning that emotional bond, not necessarily creating an authentic, vulnerable connection. The addictive nature of this cycle can result in one-sided relationships, where one partner invests an overwhelming amount of energy into trying to reach someone emotionally unavailable. This pursuit can become all-consuming, and over time it may cause emotional fatigue as the effort is not reciprocated or is constantly met with resistance. Instead of focusing on building a real connection, the individual becomes fixated on the idea of breaking down emotional walls, which ultimately leads to a never-ending cycle of unmet emotional needs. This pursuit is driven not by genuine connection, but by the addictive nature of the challenge itself. The pursuit of emotionally detached individuals often arises from a deeply ingrained psychological pattern that centers around the thrill of the chase. When someone is emotionally distant, the mind interprets this as an opportunity to achieve something significant. Emotional detachment triggers a sense of challenge in the brain, activating our intrinsic motivation to conquer what seems difficult or out of reach. The more distant or unavailable a person is, the more our subconscious desires to break through those walls and attain a connection. This challenge, rather than being a barrier, becomes an exciting and desirable puzzle to solve. Our brain becomes invested in the idea of overcoming the emotional distance, perceiving the effort as rewarding in and of itself. This dynamic is rooted in the brain's reward system, which releases dopamine when we make progress towards something that feels valuable or hard to achieve. Each small step closer to breaking down emotional barriers is accompanied by a sense of accomplishment, reinforcing the drive to continue the pursuit. This process creates a cycle, one where the emotional distance keeps the individual invested, as the brain starts associating the challenge with fulfillment. The more detached the person is, the more the pursuit becomes an obsession, not just for emotional connection, but for the victory of breaking through those defenses. The attachment is not to the individual, but to the idea of winning them over, to being the one who succeeds where others might fail. As this pattern continues, it can distort the true nature of a relationship. The focus shifts away from building a genuine emotional connection to winning the emotional battle. The chase itself becomes the reward, and the real emotional needs of both partners are often neglected. Over time, this imbalance can lead to frustration and disappointment, as the pursuit becomes more about proving something to oneself than creating a fulfilling relationship. The cycle of emotional pursuit becomes self-perpetuating, reinforcing the idea that true connection lies in conquering emotional detachment rather than in fostering true intimacy and vulnerability. The allure of emotionally detached individuals is deeply intertwined with the brain's innate wiring for pursuit and reward. When a person is emotionally distant, it triggers a response in the brain that associates the detachment with value. The emotional distance becomes a challenge, and challenges inherently activate the brain's reward systems. Humans are naturally drawn to what feels scarce or difficult to obtain, and when emotional availability is withheld, the pursuit of that connection becomes more enticing. The brain, craving novelty and unpredictability, interprets this emotional detachment as something to be conquered, a goal to achieve. The desire to break through emotional walls becomes a driving force. Each effort to bridge the gap feels like a small victory releasing dopamine, the chemical responsible for motivation and pleasure. As the pursuit continues, the brain becomes conditioned to associate emotional distance with reward. This cycle is self-reinforcing, with each breakthrough providing a sense of accomplishment that fuels the desire to push further. The person who is emotionally detached becomes an object of fascination, not necessarily because of who they are, but because they represent a challenge that needs to be overcome. The mind becomes fixated on the process of breaking through emotional barriers, and this fixation can become addictive. The more emotionally distant the individual, the more effort is put into the pursuit, and the more rewarding the chase feels. This dynamic can quickly spiral into a cycle where the actual emotional connection becomes secondary to the pursuit of breaking down walls. The reward is no longer the emotional closeness itself, but the validation that comes with overcoming the detachment. Over time, this can lead to emotional exhaustion, as the pursuit becomes all-consuming, and the deep, vulnerable connection that is needed for real intimacy remains elusive. The relationship dynamic becomes imbalanced, with one partner continuously investing energy into a challenge that may never be met with the reciprocal emotional availability they are seeking. The addictive nature of the pursuit leads to a distorted view of what true emotional connection should look like. The attraction to emotionally distant individuals often reveals deeper subconscious patterns. that govern our relationships. When someone is emotionally detached, the brain perceives this as a challenge that triggers both curiosity and desire. The emotional withdrawal seems to hold something valuable, something not easily attainable. This perception of scarcity drives the brain's reward system, reinforcing the desire to close the gap and gain access to that emotionally unavailable person. As humans, we are hardwired to seek what seems difficult to obtain, and this is where the emotional detachment becomes a powerful pull. It's not just about the person, it's about the challenge they represent. This dynamic is deeply tied to the way our brains respond to pursuit. The more emotionally distant a person is, the more the brain becomes engaged in breaking down the emotional walls. Each small success in the pursuit feels rewarding, and the brain releases dopamine, an essential chemical that reinforces motivation and behavior. With every small victory in bridging that emotional divide, the reward center is activated, encouraging further pursuit. This constant release of dopamine leads to an addictive cycle, where the chase itself becomes increasingly pleasurable. The more difficult the person is to reach emotionally, the more satisfying the journey becomes. This dynamic often results in the pursuit becoming more about overcoming the emotional barrier than forming an authentic emotional connection. In this cycle, emotional availability takes a back seat and the focus shifts entirely toward the pursuit itself. The emotional detachment becomes an obstacle to be conquered, and the process of winning the person over becomes the ultimate goal. Over time, this pattern can create a disconnect from the true emotional needs of both partners. The individual pursuing the emotionally detached person may find themselves fixated on the idea of winning the challenge rather than fostering a genuine connection. This can lead to frustration and dissatisfaction, as the pursuit becomes a never-ending cycle that never truly fulfills the deeper emotional longing. The addictive nature of this cycle can prevent true intimacy from ever forming, leaving both individuals stuck in a dynamic that is more about the chase than real connection. The allure of emotionally detached individuals is often rooted in a complex psychological process that plays out in the subconscious. When someone is emotionally distant, they unconsciously present themselves as a challenge, a puzzle to be solved. The human brain is wired to respond to what it perceives as difficult or scarce, and emotional detachment signals something that is not easily obtained. The mind, driven by a desire for connection, is drawn to the idea of breaking through that emotional barrier. The more distant someone is, the more effort the brain perceives as necessary to create closeness, and this sense of effort is often mistaken for value. This dynamic triggers the brain's reward systems, releasing chemicals like dopamine that reinforce the behavior of pursuit. With every small step closer to breaking through the emotional wall, the brain rewards the individual, creating a sense of accomplishment and reinforcing the idea that the pursuit is worthwhile. The more emotionally unavailable a person is, the greater the sense of challenge becomes and the more satisfying it feels when progress is made. This pursuit is often driven not by the desire to connect with the person emotionally, but by the drive to overcome the challenge of their emotional detachment. The chase becomes the focus, and the emotional availability of the person becomes secondary. Over time, this process can lead to an unhealthy attachment to the chase itself. The reward is no longer the emotional connection, but the validation that comes with breaking through the emotional barriers. The more effort is put into the pursuit, the more satisfying it becomes, reinforcing the cycle and making it harder to step away. As this cycle continues, emotional needs go unmet, and the relationship becomes more about the pursuit and less about genuine intimacy. The pursuit of emotional detachment can leave both individuals feeling disconnected, with one person continuing to chase a person who remains emotionally unavailable, and the other remaining distant, stuck in a cycle that prevents real connection from forming. The fascination with emotionally distant individuals can be understood through the lens of the brain's attraction to challenges and rewards. When someone is emotionally unavailable, it often activates a subconscious desire to break through that barrier. Our minds are wired to seek what feels unattainable, and emotional detachment creates a sense of scarcity. Scarcity, in the eyes of the brain, is associated with value. The more emotionally distant a person is, the more appealing they become simply because they represent something difficult to obtain. This dynamic often shifts the focus from genuine connection to the challenge of overcoming emotional walls. As the pursuit continues, the brain's reward systems are activated. Every small breakthrough, every attempt to reach the emotionally distant person, triggers the release of dopamine, reinforcing the behavior. Dopamine is the same chemical responsible for motivation and pleasure, and it plays a major role in driving the cycle of emotional pursuit. Each effort to get closer to the emotionally unavailable individual feels like a small victory, reinforcing the idea that the chase itself is rewarding. The more emotionally distant the person is, the more satisfying the pursuit becomes, and this process can quickly become addictive. In this cycle, the individual pursuing emotional detachment may lose sight of their initial intention to form a genuine emotional connection. The focus shifts from the desire for true intimacy to the thrill of the chase. Emotional connection becomes secondary to the validation that comes with breaking down the emotional walls. The more distant the person remains, the more invested the pursuer becomes in continuing the cycle. As this pattern continues, the emotional needs of both individuals go unmet, and the relationship becomes more about the pursuit than the connection itself. This cycle can leave both partners stuck in a loop, with one partner continuously seeking an emotional breakthrough, while the other remains emotionally distant, ultimately preventing true intimacy from developing.